This is Education Without Borders by Wanjiku, the engineer. We are going to look at the structural engineer's considerations when dealing with the difficult terrain. You sometimes look for a job for a consultancy and you're given and you feel very happy just to find that after being given, you start spending sleepless nights because you are given a site to design on a very, very difficult terrain. By difficult, I mean the slopes are so high and the distance between the one building and the next is almost like a vertical drop. We are talking about like 9 meters drop, yet you're supposed to do the structural design. That's what we are talking about, the headache and the sleepless nights you may spend because of that. So the client would be interested in putting up a structure next to an adjacent one. And you find on my left, that is the existing terrain, and that's what we are aiming at on my right. Indeed, as a structural engineer, you need to really put into consideration very many things. And mostly, the first thing you have to think about is how to retain the earth, retaining walls from all directions. And remember, you don't have a lot of space. So you are working within very restricted space. So you have to consider all the stresses and the forces that your retaining wall you have to withstand. So on my left, you see a retaining wall, the foundation, which is right next to a river, a riparian ground. So you cannot extend your construction beyond the area given by the water authorities. And we aim at getting to what you see on my right. What does that entail? It entails that you have to consider not only the retaining wall, which has to be able to withstand a lot of pressure, and also you have to build up the ground. The ground has to be built up to a level whereby it will be accessible. You see on the far right, there's a building, and the client would want to put up another building. Otherwise, the whole of that land, you have to be landscaped, and maybe it may not be very accessible. The amount of money they may spend doing the landscaping, they would rather put up another building. So it means, one, doing retaining walls all around, then building up the ground, as you can see, and then rolling it, consolidating the ground to the required consolidation levels until you keep building the levels, as you can see on my diagram, on the photograph. And after you get to the levels with the consultation with the architect, then you mark out your building foundation. You see, because of that, we are dealing with is a residential house, but because of the depth and the terrain, you can see from the marked out photograph that we shall have columns, very many columns, and column bases are what are shown as rectangular areas. So we have quite a number of columns, and remember, all these will be buried below the ground because you may not have basements, they may not be accessible. So what we are seeing here is what entails putting up a foundation to be able to cope with a difficult, highly sloping terrain, which would otherwise not have been useful. You can see in the foreground, there is already the retaining wall. You can see that slope. And that line there, that will finally be our ground level. So we are talking about being at a level of 9 meters below the final built up level. What does that mean? It means within the building itself. And don't forget, this is just a residential building. It's not a commercial building. It's within a residential estate. You have to incorporate a lot of retaining walls, civil works. So a lot of work goes into designing these retaining walls to be able to retain the earth as it's built up. You can see this is the same photograph, and these are the foundations of the intermediate retaining wall. So even within the building itself, from one room to the other, from one space to the other, there will have to be some retaining walls so that if you have stepped levels, the ground has to be retained. It's not cheap, it's expensive, but it's worth it, especially if you're on a prime land and you don't want to leave it waste. That's another photograph showing also progress of the retaining wall. Intermediate retaining wall has now been concreted, concreting work in progress. You finish that, you put up the columns. You can see these are columns. And remember, don't forget, this is a residential house. So it's not a commercial house, but you can see the reinforcement in the columns because they'll have to withstand retaining the ground below the ground floor slab. You can see in that photograph, building up, the columns have been built up, they're coming up together with the retaining walls. In the foreground, you can see the original house that the client had put up when they thought that there would be too much wasted ground. It will not add value. So that shows the progress of retaining walls. You can see the extent of the retaining walls, and don't forget, this will eventually be below the ground. These are columns, concreted and curing. You can see the ground level. We are coming up to the ground level step by step. You can see also in the far end a retaining wall that separates the existing building to the new one, adjacent one. Both of them belong to the same client. And these are the retaining walls are coming up, you can see. Don't forget, I keep reminding you, they will finally be buried below the ground. That's what it means to build on a difficult terrain, very slopey. These are retaining walls, cavity walls within. These are still within the building. The areas you need to put cavity walls. The areas you need to, to waterproof. As you can see, we are coming up. We are very close. You can see where there is a man at far end. That will be the ground level. You can see now we are coming up to the ground level. That's another view of the ground level is what I'm showing by cursor. These are still the retaining walls still coming up. We are talking about retaining walls extending for 9 meters from where we had our bases. Below the ground, these are still some of the retaining walls which have to follow the profile of the building plan. This is waterproofing. The dark black surface painting you find is waterproofing treatment so that we don't have the nagging issue of damp. This is another view of waterproofing. You waterproof the retaining walls within the foundation. A closer view of waterproofing in progress of the retaining walls. So in other words, we are saying we have now come to the ground level and buried. We are now 9 meters above the original base. Now we have started the foundation or the ground beam. We need a ground beam. If you're already 9 meters above, you must tie the columns with the ground beam. So this is a setting out of the ground beam. And that's another view of the ground beam setting out. You can see from the far end, your retaining walls. You ground beam in the process of being done. These are other views of other areas also coming up as shown earlier. So your ground beams are now have the formwork in place and ready to be concreted, as you can see. Concreting is also a challenge. You can see it has to be done from a level high up there and then transported through a chute to the level without being careful not to cause degradation. There we go. These are some other parts of the structures, retaining walls, the columns, the foundations for those, depending on the levels of the ground. So we are working below ground. So the other challenge here is that you have to work with teams that know exactly what they are doing. That is still a team that is working on one section of the foundation. That's another view, a closer view. And there we are now, the ground beams have been done. We are now on the ground slab. We have now, as we know it, assume that we have started our ground slab. And we are already 9 meters above. That's the water damp-proof membrane, the polythene, to be able to protect. Remember, all this, what you see, that earth material has been brought in. It was not the original. So that's the ground level, the ground slab under construction. There we go. Now our building is taking a bit of shape. We have concreted our slab and we are going on step by step. And now you can see in relation to the original ground, the house, we are not very far deep as we were originally. And the ground slab construction, some details, we have now come to the first floor. This was a townhouse, so it has ground first floor. That's the first floor formwork. And the formwork, or another view of the formwork, and construction continues. And now the roof is done, the structure is done. The next issue has to be with the civil works, the access roads. So those ones also require very detailed and very good designs from the structural engineer because they are built up using, again, retaining walls. So we talked about retaining walls within the house itself. We also have retaining walls within the road itself. And finally, when all is finished, landscaping. That's the landscaping. You can see the built up, all this is built up. Those are the external retaining walls. The internal retaining walls are already buried within the building, and there are different technologies of dealing with the retaining and landscaping as seen in that photograph. So our project is almost coming to an end and is now fully handed over to the landscaper to make sure that it looks as what was envisaged by the client. There we go. You can see now our new house, our new residential, state-of-the-art. It is a high-end, in a high-end estate in one of our cities. That's a view of how the house looks like, and having dealt more with the landscaping, more with the foundations than even the superstructure itself. If you're interested in more content like this on how structural engineers headache in unique projects, then view my channel. Feel free to like it, to share, and also to subscribe. And also don't forget to comment below.